So, one of the most persistent debates in the language acquisition world has been the debate about the sufficiency or lack thereof of comprehensible input for becoming fluent in another language. Now, this topic hits near and dear to me because I've really experienced firsthand the fallout from this debate, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit tonight. This played very heavily into my choice of a topic for my PhD. When I did my PhD, I actually did my PhD in language acquisition for specifically concentrating on English language learners who wanted to become proficient in English enough to be able to be successful on the college or the university level. So, with that in mind, I went and interviewed people who had been successful on the college level, despite the fact that they were that they had learned English as a second language. Now, this was especially interesting to me because Spanish is my second language, and I did my master's degree in a program conducted entirely in Spanish. Even though I could already speak Spanish, when it came time to read textbooks in Spanish, do my writings in Spanish, write my thesis in Spanish, all of the things that I had to do, I knew that that was another animal. And I really had to curtail some other activities to devote myself more completely to studying Spanish on a whole new level. And so I was already familiar with the development of academic language skills in another language, but I wanted to go ahead and study that on the doctoral level and really try to find commonalities between people who have done that, who have crossed that Rubicon, I might say, and been able to learn English on that level. One of the reasons why that was intensely interesting to me was because I've had a lot of friends and acquaintances from Mexico or from El Salvador, from places where they grew up speaking Spanish. Possibly they came to the United States and they learned English quite well enough to get around. They could talk to people near their house. They could go to church with people who spoke English. They could do their shopping. They could go to work. All of the things that you would expect. But when it came to using English on an academic level, a lot of them were very stymied. They felt very stuck where they were at because intuitively they knew that they would not be able to handle textbooks, college level writing, engaging in discussions in a classroom on an academic level, all of the academic vocabulary, etc. And a lot of them, knowing that, felt like they had very few resources to be able to move forward and simply stayed where they were at, did not go on and pursue academic studies. So that was very interesting to me. And along the way, I had a lot of experiences with people on all different sides of this issue. Now, for my part, I began learning Spanish when I was in high school as a freshman. The program that we had, or the program that I was, I almost said subjected to, but that is definitely not really what I meant. The program that I experienced, how about that, was very heavy on teaching explicit grammar and teaching explicit vocabulary, as well as audiolingual method pattern practice. There were stories to read. There was a lot of translation involved, and I don't think any of that hurt me one bit. I really don't. I remember doing the ALM activities and almost feeling something shift in my brain as I got used to conjugating verbs correctly and manipulating which form of those verbs I would use. We did have to learn vocabulary very quickly in the program that I was in. and it was a requirement. And back then, I graduated in 1981. Back then, you really did have to do the work if you were going to pass the class. And so there was a lot of vocabulary to learn. And I remember that we learned all of our basic grammar really through the subjunctive, present and past subjunctive, by the end of our second year. So that doesn't mean that we were good at that yet, but it does mean that we had a foundation that was laid. So that was my experience. From that point, then I began studying on my own, and there is one commonality that I've seen in people who are successful language learners. A lot of times they are very autodidactic. I remember going to my Spanish teacher as a freshman. I was very excited about learning Spanish. I asked her, how long am I going to have to study before I'll actually be able to use my language skills, use Spanish on a conversational level? And without skipping a beat, she said 3 years. Well, I was young and dumb. I believed her. When I say I believed her, what I mean is I really didn't realize that the majority of the people who took the class were taking it just for the credit, and they never really did retain or add to their level. But yet I knew some who did. There were people who absolutely did acquire those skills and go on with them. And I can think of one in particular, but it seemed like that wasn't the most people to actually do that, to develop language skills and actually use them, wasn't the most outrageous or outlandish thing you've heard of. Whereas in modern times, a lot of times people take the classes, but actually developing bilingual skills on a useful level that they retain and go on and use when the class is over seems to very much be the exception. Perhaps that's not the case everywhere, but that's what I have seen. But at any rate, I realized, I suppose, somewhere during my second year of study, as a high school, as a high schooler, I would have been a sophomore by then. I realized, it's just not going to happen. I realized that I was not going to be able to develop those Spanish skills that I wanted to have. And so back then we didn't have the internet, and so much of what is available nowadays was not available then. And so what I did was I had a radio that would pick up shortwave broadcasts. So I would go home in the afternoons and I would listen to the world's news in English. That way I would know that somebody had, there'd been a kidnapping or war had broken out in Lebanon, or someone had stolen a plane, or there had been an earthquake somewhere, a plane crash, something had happened. And so I would listen to the world news, so I already had a pretty good idea of what was going on. Then I would flip it over and listen to the world news again in Spanish from one of the Spanish-speaking channels. So at first it was very difficult. I had a little pocket dictionary. That's all I had back then, and a notebook. And I remember I would try to pick up a word or two here or there. And when I could clearly hear a word, and I couldn't understand hardly anything, but when I could clearly hear a word, I'd look it up, I'd write it down. And I just kept doing that. I just kept going to my classes, taking Spanish, but then going and listening to the news. And that was about the only outlet that I had on a regular basis. But I was fascinated by it, and I kept doing that. And I still, to this day, remember the afternoon when I went home, turned on the radio to the Spanish channel, listened to the news, and realized that I could understand it. I will never forget that day. That was an awesome day. But from there, I got a lot of friends. I wound up having a lot of friends who spoke Spanish. I went to a church in a small town close to the Illinois Quad City area, the Moline Rock Island area. And there were people from the Quad Cities who came down and started coming to our church. Then eventually they had family members that moved up from Mexico, and we became basically a bilingual congregation in which we had to start interpreting all of the services into Spanish. We'd sing in Spanish sometimes as well. And I ate a lot of beans and tortillas back then. I made a lot of friends who spoke Spanish and wound up spending a lot of time at their houses, and I wound up actually interpreting those services. And that was how I got into it. Then I went off and went into college and started taking it at the college level as well, and wound up becoming a Spanish teacher. So that was my journey. That was my journey. But along the way there, nobody had ever yet come up with just this comprehensible input approach, although I was getting input, obviously. You might say that I had some kind of well, I had a lot of exposure to the language, let's put it that way, and I did learn. But I certainly did have a grammar and vocabulary intensive background from which to draw. Now, when I went on and became a Spanish teacher, I saw a measure of success similar to what I'd had in high school. I had kids who learned Spanish, learned in the classroom up to a level where they could comfortably speak, converse, at least on a basic or a rudimentary level. They could enjoy some of the things they'd find on the internet in Spanish. They could interact in Spanish, and I felt really good about that. Well, then I went on and I got a job at a school near the Oklahoma City area. Because it's not my intention to embarrass or lampoon anybody, I'm not going to say the name of the school district, but I got on as the AP Spanish teacher there. I also had to teach third year and fourth year Spanish. And the kids that I had coming into my AP Spanish class, fourth year Spanish class, certainly third year Spanish class, were so appallingly behind in terms of their grammatical accuracy that it really was shocking, because by then they had had at least 2 years, sometimes 3 years of Spanish, and still couldn't manage the present tense. Still didn't know enough grammar to be able to conjugate verbs in the present tense. And meanwhile, what I ran into was the people in that department had gone absolutely crazy with Stephen Krashen hypotheses. They really believed, and I mean, they were the true believers, in comprehensible input, TPRS, don't correct the kids' grammar. Yeah. Try to replicate the way that they learned English naturally by letting them have that silent period in which they're just gathering input that you provide. It was incredible because this was what they believed there, and they were the true practitioners of it. And I was dealing with the results of what they had done. Now, before I go any further, I want to make it absolutely plain, absolutely clear that I do see the value in comprehensible input. I certainly use it myself. I use TPRS in my classes. I see no problem with using it, and no contradiction between my use of comprehensible input in its various forms and what I believe about the necessity of teaching explicit grammar and vocabulary. I never did see a contradiction in the two. Why can't you learn something explicitly and then go and practice it to a level of automaticity? But the big debate was these people believed, like I said, they were the true believers. They truly believed that comprehensible input was the way to go. And so when my kids, my students, couldn't even use the present tense, were so far behind it was pathetic, their solution was to give them more comprehensible input. Yeah, give them more of what did not work in the first place. Well, I didn't do that, and it really raised some eyebrows and caused some problems. Unfortunately, I wound up staying there for a year before I packed up my marbles and moved on, so to speak. But meanwhile, the students I had there, I had some nice students, especially in my AP class. A lot of those students thanked me. They came up to me and thanked me and told me how happy they were that they were finally getting good, meaty explanations. They've been used to once over lightly explanations, pop up grammars, I guess they're called, and nothing in depth. And so a lot of them just did not know. They never had explicit, like what subjunctive triggers are or why we use the subjunctive in one case but not in another. It's like they had been expected to pull all of that out of the ether just from use, and it wasn't working. It did not work. Well, after that job, I got on someplace else very directly. I participated in a foreign language teachers forum in which I described the experience I had just had. And oh my goodness, you'd think I had walked into a buzzsaw. There were people had this misconception that if you did not use comprehensible input, TPRS, and think that anything else was a waste of time, then really probably all you were doing was slogging your way through a grammar book all year. And nothing could have been further from the truth. Just because somebody does not put all of his eggs in one methodology's basket doesn't mean that all he does is do the thing that you'd consider the least effective. So that was amazing to me. But the other thing that came up here was a lot of people on that forum. It was crazy. It was almost like that, like they took their comprehensible input ideas to a religious level, and if you talked about it, you were expected to speak respectfully of TPRS, of comprehensible input. They would accuse you of using vituperative language. I've been accused of using vituperative language, like being inappropriate in the way I was speaking about it when I was discussing this. There again, this is from somebody who really had nothing against TPRS. Like I said, I use it myself, but I just didn't see it as all sufficient. I never have seen any evidence of this big dichotomy between explicit learning, which supposedly only feeds your monitor, according to Krashen's hypotheses, and explicit learning. Because I know that you can learn things explicitly, then take them and rehearse them and practice them to a point of automaticity. So I never saw the big dichotomy between the two. But at any rate, since then, a lot of evidence has come out. A lot of professors in linguistics or language acquisition have come out and said the same thing, that comprehensible input is important, but it is not sufficient, and there is nothing wrong with explicit teaching of grammar, vocabulary, giving those explanations. And so, as it turns out, at the end of all of this, I'm seeing that my assessment back then was entirely correct. So I'm not glorying in that as much as I am just happy to have the vindication, because you know teachers develop the art of teaching, and sometimes their methods will vary, but effective teachers will often be effective with the methods that they're using, because they don't follow them just according to the letter, but they do what is expedient. I hope that that's the kind of teacher that I am. I do believe in comprehensible input. I do not believe that it is sufficient, and I do not believe there is anything wrong with studying grammar, vocabulary explicitly, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that's all that I believe in doing. There needs to be a balanced combination of approaches for optimal success. That at least is my philosophy.